Symposium on Speculative Fiction. Fun fact, the Eaton Conference was first established in 1979 to complement J. Lloyd Eaton's collection of science fiction and fantasy. And, as we'll see in the trading card that we're giving out, the last Eaton Conference was held in 2013. So now we're back. This year's symposium is a symposium featuring emerging scholars from SoCal schools like Cal State Fullerton, UCLA, UCSD, Cal State LA, and of course our hosting school, campus UCR. Today's symposium will be featuring 2 grad panels, an undergrad panel, and a creative writing roundtable featuring works about topics such as speculative past, presents, and futures, archives, emerging scholars, and secondary worlds. We'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, UCHRI and the Eaton Collection, Chat's Office of the Dean, and Center for Ideas in Society, parentheses CIS. We'd also like to thank our collaborators, UCR English, the Speculative Fiction and Cultures of Science, DE, UCR Media and Cultural Studies, parentheses MCS, Archive, Museum Manuscript and Print Studies, the AMP designated emphasis. Their generous support has made the symposium possible. We also would like to respectfully acknowledge our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff. And we recognize the impact settler colonialism has had on these homelands. Please take a moment to acknowledge and reflect on the Native, Aboriginal, and Indigenous people of your area from which you are coming from. If you are unfamiliar with the original and current caretakers of the land, water, and air from your area, we highly encourage you to take the time to self-educate, reflect, and listen to these histories. We also would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ongoing genocide in Palestine, which has resulted in over 40,000 deaths, and the destruction of every university in Gaza. The UC is complicit in the genocide and has $32 billion invested in weapon manufacturers and other companies profiting off genocide. Students at the UCs, CSUs, and many other universities have been subjected to violent police repression for calling an end to colonial and apartheid violence. We stand in solidarity with Students for Justice in Palestine, Faculty for Justice in Palestine, the encampments, UAW workers on strike, and with Palestine and calling for a free Palestine. Thank you. And let me introduce our panel. Our first panel is a grad panel called Speculative Past, Presents, and Critiques. We have Isadora Petrovsky. She is a speculative fiction author who aims to draw forth the inherent queerness of the SFF, fairy tale, historical, and gothic horror genres. She is currently attending the MFA writing program at UC San Diego. Her most recent work is Turn and Run with Bitter Hill Press. To keep up with Isadora's work, follow her at Izzy Petrovsky on Instagram or visit her website. It's also on the schedule-y thing. Next, we have Amber Orbaugh. She is interested in all things genre fiction, Afrofuturist. Her work largely centers around the neo-slave narrative and genre hybridity within contemporary African American and African diasporic fiction. She is most intrigued by how the uses of generic forms create new narratives for unrepresented or unrepresentable histories. And we have Yesenia Sanchez. She is a first-year PhD student in UCR's English department. Her research focuses on the representation of dangerous women as femme fatale, as well as supernatural figures such as vampires, witches, demons, ghosts that haunt and perform sexual deviancy. In her work, she often uses an intersectional lens focused on race, gender, sexuality, and empire.
Hi, everyone. I'm Isadora, you, she, her pronouns. It's nice to meet you all. I am one of the UAW grad students strike right now for UCSD, and then ongoing genocide and violence on our campus. It's nice to be in this collaborative and community-based space right now. So yeah, I'm talking about Babel by Artist Form today, and I'm discussing speculative fiction as a kind of post-colonial critique, and thinking about it through the lens of a concept introduced by Nelson Maldonado Torres, called the non-ethics of war. Okay, here's some general points about what I'm investigating. So I'm thinking about speculative fiction as an accessible way for the public to access post-colonial or decolonial theory. I'm also thinking about how the dark academic aesthetic participates in colonial violence, but also is a mode to access a broader audience when reading and thinking about post-colonial theory, which I'll explain more later. Thinking about translation as a kind of colonial violence, but also something that is used in academia that kind of like the post-colonial at the same time. Lots of duality here. And then violence within or against the academic institution as a response to the non-ethics war. Okay. This is an overview of the literature that I'm reviewing. This is really dark. Can you see this second? Cool. Nice. All right. So I'm talking about in my paper basically on the coloniality of being by Nelson Maldonado Torres, which is the crux theory work for this piece. The work of fiction is R.F. Kuang's Word of Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an Arcane History of the Oxford Translators Revolution. I'm also thinking about Daniel Baker's work, Why We Need Dragons, The Progressive Potential Fantasy, and Shinjini's Day's review of Babel with Strange Horizons. There's also work from Frantz Fanon, Alice Moody, Stephen J. Ross, and Meg Samuelson, just some more theory people who I'm thinking about in this work. Okay, this is the Goodreads summary of what Babel is, which I'm not going to read to you. But essentially, it's this alternative history where silver working becomes the main colonial tool that Britain uses to influence all of its like colonized countries, and also to power the sort of infrastructure of England and the British Isles themselves. The work centers around Robin, who is a Chinese student at Oxford, and basically is brought up by his white English father as a tool of translation because he's both Chinese and English. He has access to both languages, which is going to be really important for how the match pairs for the silver bars work that power the colonial infrastructure, which I will explain more later. And then I think this question that is posed by Goodreads kind of gets to the crux of what I'm talking about, which is, can powerful institutions be changed from within, or does revolution always require violence? And spoiler alert, this book basically says that it does always require violence because of the violent nature of these institutions. Okay. This is just a kind of brief explanation of what dark academia is, if you're not on TikTok. Anyway, okay, so this is like a popular aesthetic even before TikTok and an online trend. So this comes up in like Donna Tartt's work, The Secret History, lots of even like Taylor Swift's new albums, pretty dark academia. You know, it's been a vibe for a while. But basically what this does is like romanticize the academic institution, romanticize violence, and sort of create like an ethos of like mental unwellness and physical unwellness within this like academic institution, but also romanticizes this like collectivity of like people banding together within the institution. It's typically very white and very male, but this work kind of subverts that. So this novel in of itself is marketed as dark academia. Kuang herself, when asked to describe the novel, uses the same language. But I think that really what she's doing here is operating within this genre as a mode of accessing like public perception. So if people are like, oh, this is a dark academia novel, they'll pick it up, they'll be excited about that kind of romanticization, and then be hit with a more like critique of the academic institution. But also I think Kuang in and of herself is also a participant in these academic institutions in real life, and does find a lot of like comfort and holiness there. So there's that duality at the same time, which I'll talk about more later. Okay, so the non-ethics of war is a concept introduced in On the Coloniality of Being by Nelson Maldonado Torres. And he defines coloniality as the long-term socio-political and economic ramifications of colonialism, and the coloniality of being in and of itself as this existential crisis connected to genetic and historical dimensions of being. So it's that duality of back and forth, being both in the institution or in the colonized place or a part of the colonial structure, but also acting against it or being othered by it. So the non-ethics of war in and of itself becomes a state or a condition that's created by colonialism. So because coloniality and emphasizes like a normalized state of violence, there becomes this non-ethics of war, which means that because violence is normalized, violence in response to violence becomes like basically naturalized or as an only effective response because other things like lobbying and organization don't work as effectively because of the violent nature. Okay, so I talked a little bit about before the silver bar match pairs in Babel. Basically, these are inscribed with translated phrases. So the main examples are like there would be a Chinese phrase and then an English phrase, and the space between those in between that translation and the discrepancy between languages is where this like arcane or magical power comes from. And this is pretty relevant to the kind of in-betweenness between institution and the other. Here in this work, Babel is also the name of the Translation Institute at Oxford. In this, it's not a real place, but the imagined place in this work. And this is the only school within Oxford in this alternative history that accepts people of color, so and also women. So basically, they are accumulating people from countries that the English have colonized in order to get that back and forth between being fluent in a language that is not English and also being fluent in English. So the other becomes a kind of colonial tool. And then the institutional violence that is wrought by Babel is they act as basically a tool of the English government to go into colonized countries and barter. And in this case, like amplify the opium crisis in China and like wreak more violence. And so that what R.F. Kuang poses in this work is that in order for that violence to be undone, it requires more violence. So the Hermes society that stems out of the institution becomes a collective other that fights back. And in order to enact change, they basically sacrifice themselves and kind of go on like an amplified, more violent version of like a strike. Yeah. And in the way that the work ends is that the translation of translation, like basically creates an explosion with the silver bars because the in between the translation in and of itself is a kind of. Okay. So I think it just should be acknowledged that both Kuang and myself are operating within colonial institutions as people working and writing in an academic environment. So this is particularly pertinent to thinking about that kind of duality where the critique is still coming from within the institution, and that it could potentially be impossible to kind of subvert those forms within these kinds of institutions. I think this is especially relevant with the ongoing genocide and police violence on campus. That just really shows the kind of violent nature of these institutions, even when we, as the like academic collective, are trying to like subvert those things. Okay. So why speculative fiction as a mode to do this? Speculative fiction has always operated in the spaces between, though historically has been very male and very white. It's kind of shifting more as a mode to like expressing other, and I think has always done that in some ways. Whether it's been recognized by the speculative fiction people or not. And so basically I'm positing that speculativeness and fabulation is a mode of de-escalating the violence of translation. Not only am I kind of de-translating the theory from Kuang's work, Kuang is like translating the theory into her work. So the speculative aspect kind of de-escalates that sort of violence and presents like more of a fluidity. And just thinking again about the in-betweenness between cultural context and meaning and the aesthetic power for fantasy to reach a broader audience. I think that speculative fiction really works as a way to make this kind of these kind of theoretical concepts more accessible to a larger group of people. And that's it. Thank you.
I'm Amber Orville, recently graduated from CSUN. Super great. So this is actually my master's project. So title here, Remythologizing History and Detailing Facts of Secret Lives of the 9 Negro Chief of George Washington. I had to keep my title short because he refused to keep his short. So, all right. So I gave you guys a little bit of an overview of what I plan to try to do today. I have a funny little thing between my introduction and my conclusion where we're talking about the history and story, and then we're going to end with the story of history. Sort of move us through each of these slides, but here's just an idea of what I'm going to try to get through. So starting off with history and the story, the whole point of this short story, which is only available online, which I find an interesting mode of publication. The whole point of it is to look at the kind of mythologies that we tell ourselves, right? Or the ones that we learn and then never question after that. So I begin with, why does the average American never question the outlandish idea that George Washington wore wooden dentures? That's kind of what this entire story is built out of. The entire premise is that Clark is telling us these false histories, these fantastic histories of what the historical data that does exist, which is a line in a ledger that just says that his dentist bought 9 Negro teeth, and that's it. We have this idea that George Washington had wooden dentures, but it is mythologized. It's just not true. The thing that we kind of want to hide with us is the idea that dude had other people's teeth in his mouth, right? It's an uncomfortable reality. But it's interesting here because in the 9 vignettes that this story is built around, Clark is describing those original tooth owners, but then punctuating each one with how the tooth like actually affects George Washington and his actions. So, he builds on the foundation of the slave and the neo-slave narrative to combat the inherently racist notion of monolithic racial identifications. He does so by presenting fictionalized details of the 9 tooth owners and shows that they lack any other comfortable identifier that can group them. He's essentially taking that Negro label and saying there is no way to say that that even comfortably identifies all 9 of these people. And there's nothing else that does so either in these stories. He's thereby forcing a reader to recognize the white supremacist power at work in the historically based mythologies that become part of our national consciousness. So, a little bit on speculative fiction and the neo-slave narrative, kind of more on the neo-slave narrative, I'm not going to lie. We have a little bit about the mythology of George Washington here. One of the other things that this comes out of is the way that we've mythologized Frederick Douglass. So, there is an idea that when we talk about slave narratives, especially when getting into the neo-slave narrative, everybody goes back to Douglass. He's like the only voice that we really seem to look at in any, I don't know, certain terms. What I think the neo-slave narrative does is it looks at that mythology, that mythologized figure, where we view only Frederick Douglass's story as what we believe a slave narrative should look like. We look at those neo-slave narratives and we get an idea that they're demythologizing this in effect. I argue that what Clark actually does is he remythologizes. So he's attempting to create a sort of new system of God to look up to. But instead of recognizing it as a singular story, he's creating something that is going to tear down those monolithic ideals that like Douglass's narrative sort of puts into, again, the national consciousness. He does so in the beginning with a haunting. So the very first vignette that we are introduced to, the very first original tooth owner that we are introduced to, is a blacksmith. He's described in the story as knowing the secret language of iron. He beseeched his creations to bind the spirits of their wielders as surely as they bound flesh. For the blacksmith understood what masters had chosen to forget, when you make a man or woman a slave, you enslave yourself in turn. Sort of the point that I want to get at with highlighting this quote in particular is that the blacksmith recognizes that it isn't just a master who is giving a type of culture or expectation to an enslaved person. That enslaved person is affecting the way that the master is also going to look at them. And you can't help it. Part of what I want to get at with this is looking at the way Judith Butler talks about the psychic life of power as being the subject who is in a subjugated position. One of the ways that she argues that they kind of reinforce the psychic life of power is by constantly demanding continuity, visibility, and place. Part of what the blacksmith actually ends up doing with his power is the effect towards Washington. Washington is never able to truly see the way that these things are happening to him. For example, when he wears the blacksmith's tooth, the blacksmith's spirit and the way that it's bound to that tooth causes him to constantly hear the sound of like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. And instead of recognizing it as disembodied, he halts all ironworking on his plantation. But he still can't get it to stop. But instead of recognizing that it's something outside of his control, he keeps trying to exert control over that thing. So that visibility part isn't there. There is nothing that's actually going to be able to be recognized by Washington. Therefore, he's actually operating outside of the power that is hegemonic and like bound to his master. There we go. So there's a secondary interesting thing that I will try to connect to my previous idea as we continue. Actually, get to that. No, yes. So we understand the haunting a little bit now, but there's a secondary thing that's happening along with the haunting. So we have in our second vignette the idea that the second Negro tooth belonging to George Washington came from a slave from the kingdom of Abani, what the English with their inarticulate tongues called Bonnyland, and much to his annoyance, hence him a Bonny man. In this vignette, there's a very interesting thing that happens where we get a very rare glimpse into the Middle Passage. If anybody in here is like used to neo-slave narratives, has read a few, it's pretty rare to get retellings of the Middle Passage. I think that that's one of the more difficult and sticking points for the genre. So what we do get a lot of is how people believe the Middle Passage has affected the sort of national idea of Blackness and Black people. So to borrow from Bertette Spillers, she believes that during enslavement, the body becomes removed from both gender and ethnicity as it transitions through the Middle Passage. The body is stripped of personhood and is brought to that 0 degree of social conceptualization in which the crime of stealing a person and enslaving them is not a crime against them, but a crime against their flesh. She also therefore argues that the act of racialization actually comes from that stripping of gender and ethnicity. You can't be of separate tribes if you don't have an ethnic tie. So the sort of idea that is being reinforced here is that the Bonny man actually befriends a merman on his way through the Middle Passage. He is like chained next to a merman who is also being sold into slavery. What ends up happening during their back and forth is they do get into that racialization a little bit. They end up telling each other stories, sharing songs of their people, sharing cultural artifacts with each other. And what this does is it gives into that racialization, but it also helps them survive. There's a very hopeful message towards the end of this. And the merman teaches the Bonny man a song that is supposed to call up like the dark and deep things of the ocean as a way of kind of recalling vengeance against the people who have hurt them. And when Washington wears his tooth, he can only hear that song, but he doesn't know where it's coming from, and he doesn't recognize it. He just finds it very ominous. there's an interesting way that that ties to a sort of racialization that is now encompassing Washington as well. So we'll get to that a little bit after we kind of talk about cultural sharing. So in the sixth vignette, we have Solomon, who's a very interesting case because she's not actually from this world. So she is pulled through a portal by a sorcerer who is very quickly killed because I think literally in the story they say something to the effect of we can't have people knowing that you can pull Negroes out of thin air. Essentially saying that it would ruin their chances at slave trade. It's a very funny moment in the story, but it's still awkward, right? But Solomon is an interesting case because she has no chance of actually returning to her own world. But she still decides to be with the people that she is bound to in her enslavement because she sees that she can help them. So although she has like the knowledge to work outside of the like trappings of other enslaved people, she has access to technology. She's able to make medicines that other people can't even process yet. She doesn't use that to buy her freedom. She uses it to make the people around her more comfortable. So this ties really well to what Hartman is talking about in Sadea Hartman is talking about in Lose Your Mother. The transience of the slave existence still leaves its traces in how Black people imagine home, as well as how we speak of it. We may have forgotten our country, but we haven't forgotten our dispossession. There's a way that this being dispossessed and not being able to return to a home forces all of the teeth in a sense, like all of the original tooth owners in a sense, to recognize that they have to make a home here in some way or another. What gets interesting is when we start talking about hybridity and dental miscegenation. So coming back to that idea, George Washington has Black people's teeth in his mouth. He is constantly being affected by this, not even cultural artifact, this bodily artifact that is sort of imprinting the memory of Black identity onto him. We can also see this just generally in the story as, again, with the example of Solomon, she has all of this knowledge that she's now using to affect the landscape of Mount Vernon. As she is affecting the landscape of Mount Vernon, she is giving her parts of her culture to this place that Washington is now taking credit for, and in a way is kind of taking credit for her culture. Whether or not that's fully recognized, again, does not matter. It all has to do with the fact that the people who know. One of the things that is interesting in this is the end of this kind of long quote here on the side. The slaves knew well the many agricultural reforms at Mount Vernon, for which their master took credit, was actually Solomon's genius. It doesn't matter if power recognizes that it's being affected, because it's being affected. Here, I also have another interesting and weird tie-in with Tavia Nyong'o's work, the amalgamation waltz. I think the best part to point out here is race thinking may serve as the great American invasion, but it has also at times proved dissonant to national memory. Again, we're thinking of the ways that an almost cultural miscegenation works, right? We have this idea of cultural hybridity that we can't really comfortably separate. We don't necessarily have a white supremacist past. We have a white supremacist memory, right? So that breaks it down to the actual genre of what I'm talking about. I think the best way to talk about this is to change just the idea of a neo-slave narrative into an Afrofuturist neo-slave narrative. It's doing something different, right? We get to the end of this, and the final vignette that we're looking at is actually not influenced by magic in the way that the other ones are. We have a lot less magic. Going through this actual story, you have somebody who travels through her dreams. You have people being pulled through portals. You got mermen. Like, we have so much going on, that pulls from other genres. And then we end on what is almost just classic neo-slave narrative. It's just about a woman who really hopes that someday she will live to be free. And that's it. It ends with Washington finally writing the mythologized fact that he does free his slaves upon his wife's death. And Emma is one of the people who gets to be free. It sort of reminds us that there is magic in hope and that there is a sort of subversion that is always possible when it comes to this sort of power. It does also kind of question the agency of Washington in an interesting way. I have no answers about that. So if anybody is really good with agency stuff, please talk to me about it. Because I think that that is one of the areas that is very questionable in this story, but I have no answers for, right? And then, essentially, Secret Lives does not produce new history. It uses the aesthetics and tropes of multiple genres to call attention to the inability to cross certain cultural boundaries within our own understanding of what it is to be American. By creating new mythologies and blending genres, The Secret Lives forces a reader to question what they believe about the basis of their own culture. The amalgamation of genres within the story comes to reflect the multifaceted and multicultural reality of American life. Again, we don't have a white supremacist history, we have a white supremacist memory. So considering the way that this country is so multicultural, founded on so many atrocities, but atrocities that have both affected the way that we see ourselves and the way that we remember our histories. I think it's important to always keep that in mind. And the amalgamation of genres and the way that they come together in this story, I think really highlight that sort of idea that there isn't one way to remember all of this stuff. So that's me.
Hello, everyone. So before I start, I want to preface by saying that this is a much smaller piece of a much larger research project, so please bear with me. Today, I will be presenting on uncovering Latina voices, representations of vampires in late 20th century Mexican speculative fiction. So the literary figure of the vampire is one that has haunted and enthralled most speculative fiction writers globally. In the case of Mexican speculative fiction, the figure of the vampire is one that has taken many representations over the years by men and women alike. Yet, as is common with most speculative fiction circles, the Mexican speculative fiction world in the 20th century was heavily male-dominant. This means that women often become objects of desire in male representations of vampires, leaving them to appear to have a passive position in speculative fiction. However, women's role in Mexican speculative fiction is anything but passive. Although far and few in between, the history and presence of Latinos' contributions to Mexican speculative fiction in the 20th century is one that often becomes overlooked and forgotten in archival collections. Particularly, their contribution to Mexican fanzines and short story anthologies that are published in Spanish often remain overlooked. As a feminist archival research project, this paper not only seeks to explore and uncover Latino representations of vampires in late 20th century Mexican speculative fiction through the J. Lloyd Eaton collection, but also highlight Mexican women writers who have historically and archivally been ignored. Like Livia Brenda Castro, this paper highlights the ways in which Mexican women writers portray the figure of the vampire as queering gender, experiencing pleasure, and stepping into monstrosity. It is speculative fiction and the supernatural figure of the vampire that Mexican women writers are able to explore the bounds of gender and sexuality in a largely heteronormative and patriarchal society. First, I want to briefly talk about the archival material that started and inspired this research project from the Eaton collection. It's a Mexican fanzine called Vampiros, Breve Antología Mexicana. The title of this fanzine roughly translates to Vampires, a Brief Mexican Anthology. According to the archival metadata, the fanzine was published around 1997 by the Universidad Autónoma de Tlaxcala. This particular Azov fanzine was an inaugural plaquette version that appears to be different from the regular original fanzine issues. The plaquette fanzine appears to be special because it was created in contribution with a collective known as Círculo Independiente de Ficción y Fantasía, also known as CIFF. This collective was created by H. Pascal, who is a Mexican science fiction author, contributing to this particular fanzine with his own short story, Kim, and appears to be a prominent figure in the Mexican science fiction circles. The Special Plaquette fanzine of Vampiros is composed of 9 authors, all of which only one is a woman writer. While looking at the fanzine in the Special Collections archive, I was astonished discovering that the majority of the images in the fanzines were of women as sexualized vampires or victims of vampires. For example, the cover image of the fanzine that you can see on the left side of the screen sports a mysterious figure sitting with her back to the reader in a semi-profile position. Not only can one see the bat-like wings emerging from her back, but one can also note that the figure is a woman from the visible side cleavage from her side profile. Even though women writers did not dominate Mexican science fiction or speculative fiction circles, their campy sexualized images were used to lure male audiences to read the fanzine. But why does the figure of the vampire in this particular fanzine visually represent the image of a woman instead of a man? With no real answer to this question, one can only acknowledge the ways in which visually the images reflect women. But literarily, most, if not all, the protagonists of the short stories in this fanzine are male. The case of gender in Azov's fanzine is interesting, as most of the victims or prey of the male vampires in the short stories are women. This leads me to one of the most telling quotes from the back of the fanzine that piqued my interest to witnessing and querying the representation of gender in this material. The rough translation of the paragraph states, and I quote, "Vampires, that is to say, the shadows that oscillate between the surface that marks the border between the skin and the psyche, those spheres that come from far away and too close. Vampires, the border between real violence and symbolic brutality," end quote. Stating that vampires are the border between real violence and symbolic brutality leads one to argue that vampires in this particular fanzine represent women's and men's subconscious fears of the social, cultural, patriarchal violence inflicted on their mind and body regularly. That is to say that the quote monster, or in this case the vampire, lurking in the shadows may take on a masculine or feminine persona, ready to pounce on its prey. In the case of the male writers editing this anthology, one of the first visible victims of a vampire is a woman. Yet in certain images of the fanzine, it becomes apparent that they also believe, and I argue fear, the way women can become the violent vampire. There's an image of a person, unknown gender, sucking the blood of a person's wrist in Gerardo Cifuentes' short story, Merlina y el Diablito. The victim's wrist is wearing a bracelet and a ring in their forefinger. It could be argued that the victim is a woman. The vampire feasting on its victim has black messy hair over their eyes, while also wearing 2 visible earrings on each ear. The inability to distinguish the gender of the vampire plays into the idea of vampires transcending the boundary of the human and stepping into monstrosity. Transgressing the binary of the human is also apparent in the vampire image of Livia Brenda Castro's short story, Aliento de sí mismo, roughly translated to the breath of one's own. In this image, one sees a woman wearing a campy, elegant, over-the-top outfit with a headpiece. She is visibly displaying her vampire teeth and fangs with parted lips. This is probably one of the only images of a woman visibly representing a vampire. The rest of the images in the fanzine are mostly women wearing full white attire in a coffin or haunting the reader as one continues reading the short stories. With the juxtaposition of male protagonist vampires in the short stories and the images of women, it becomes clear that there's more being said about gender than meets the eye. I would argue that while female protagonist vampires are not centered in the short stories, there's a fear of gender queering that haunts the figure of the vampire in Azov's fanzine. An example of gender queering could be seen in Livia Brenda Castro's short story, A Breath of One's Own. In this short story, one follows the male protagonist, vampire Luzpan, who contemplates his immortal existence and identity in a mortal world. Luzpan states, and I quote, "One becomes something else. One becomes sharp and androgynous, a little translucent and definitely seductive. One becomes an other creature and something far from human," end quote. In this reflection, Luzpan acknowledges transcending the human binary and becoming androgynous, a creature but equally seductive. While Luzpan is stated to be a male by Castro, male pronouns of él are used to refer to him. There's an inevitable gender queering that Castro is playing with in his character. He isn't only male, but a monstrous male that needs to seductively lure his victims to their demise. Sexuality and gender in a vampire in this particular story are seen as weapons to enchant and lure one's prey. The way that Castor plays with gender, sexuality, and pleasure in her short story is vastly different than the rest of the male authors in the anthology. Unlike some male writers in this anthology, Castor does not verge into the sexual voyeuristic idea of women literally sleeping with a vampire perpetrator. Instead, Castor contemplates the closest thing vampires feel to encountering pleasure or gratification as an immortal vampire, without the penetration of sexual organs. The narrator states, and I quote, orgasm. Guzman cannot think in another parallel human sensation, getting lost in a far and unknown universe that explodes from the deepest parts onto the outside. He feels with each drop he absorbs how each fiber and nerve of her soul dilutes and is remade, how the person in his arms begins to depart life to become a part of him, end quote. The act of Guzman eating and sucking the blood of his prey is described as akin to a sexual act, an orgasmic experience that reaches levels of pleasure and satisfaction for the vampire. However, not much is said of the victim's experience. In this radical act of Guzman eating his prey, Castor is able to subvert the male-dominant ideologies of what they constitute sex and pleasure to be in the figure of a vampire. While romanticized, yes, this act is still inherently violent for the victim, as it talks about taking one's life, but it is done in such a way that it is removed from the pornographic. In other words, this scene did not feel like one was participating or witnessing a man's sexual fantasies or fetishes displayed in a story. Furthermore, Castor states, quote, this is why Guzman, in making love with each victim and ordering total abandonment, he feels tears flood his face, creating questions that have been responded until today, for a selfish act that one can call destiny, end quote. Castor appears to humanize the monstrous predator as he cries after killing his victim. But don't be fooled, he doesn't cry because he feels bad for his victim. Instead, he cries because he knows that he will never be able to be closer to a person than the act of feasting. The closest thing to a partner he will ever feel will be when his victim is dying in his arms, even though they will never know it. He will forever be a lonely androgynous monster. So one of the intentions behind this archival research project is to highlight Mexican women writers who have largely been forgotten in both the archive and speculative fiction circles in Mexico and the US. By highlighting their existence and works, I hope to participate in a much larger archival project of building a feminist history of Mexican women writers in speculative fiction. For this purpose, I want to take the time to highlight the only Mexican woman writer that was included in this special plaquette version of the Azov fanzine. Her name is Livia Brenda Castro, and she was born in Puebla, Mexico in 1974. According to a website called Worlds Without End, Castro is an editor, writer, and teacher. She is stated to have studied Hispanic language and literature at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, also known as UNAM, and is known for publishing her work in fanzines and independent magazines around 1994. She has easily spent over 30 years writing books in science fiction and fantasy short stories. Some of her most notable works that have historically been forgotten are her contributions to Las Escritoras Libras, Año 2, published in June 2022, Ginocoides, Las Hembras de los Androids, published in 2003, which we actually have in the Eaton collection, and Así se acaba el mundo, Cuentos Mexicanos Apocalípticos, published in December 2012. These are only a few of her many contributions and works in different mediums. All of this information and some of her longer repertoire is digitally archived in a website known as tercerafundacion.net. This website is a nonprofit culture association made up of fans who love reading science fiction, fantasy, and horror in Spanish. They catalog and create an archive of authors and their works. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's a good start. According to the short biography written by Worlds Without End, Livia Brenda Castro is still very much active in the speculative fiction space in Mexico City. Not only has she been living there since 2001, but she has also co-founded a collective known as the Pómulo de Tesla, a multidisciplinary working group that promotes dialogue between the arts and sciences, with a special focus on science fiction. She continues to write science fiction and fantasy, but also loves to write about astronomy, another of her passions. She also teaches literary classes and workshops in Mexico. Livia Brenda Castro is representative of many Mexican and Latina authors who find speculative fiction to be a meaningful genre to express their ideas about gender, sexuality, and pleasure, in spite of assumptions that they have not been present in literary circles or archival collections. If there's one thing that you can take away from this presentation is that Latinas have been a part of speculative fiction circles and continue to be active participants in the genre if you look hard enough. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, everyone loved what you all had to say. Sorry about that, genuinely. But yeah, I will do the Q&A part. Does anyone have questions for our panelists? Or on Zoom?
Mine is for the first presenter. I'm so sorry, I forget your name. Can you know my name?
Isadora?
Isidore. I wanted to ask if you, for your research, if you looked into R.F. Kuang's personal experience in Oxford as an Asian woman. I've heard like some like snippets of interviews that she had, so I just didn't know if you looked into this as well.
I've like looked into it a little bit, but not nearly enough. Yeah.
For Isadora, how do you think the narrative of ethics and non-ethics would be different if we had more writings of women or of other races? Since I know you said mostly it was from a white male perspective. How do you think it would be different if it was written? Do you think it would be drastically different? Do you think it would still come to the same conclusion that the overcoming of an institution has to be from an outside violent perspective? How do you think that would be?
Yeah, so Babel itself is written from a like mostly includes like multiple different races and from like a half Asian, half white perspective. I think that like if we had more works that do more of that work, that would be like helpful. But definitely the genre and the like dark academic genre is populated mostly by like white male voices. Yeah. And I think that is a part of like the perpetuation of violence. So I think that to like de-escalate that or just a little bit about would need more voices from women and people of color.
Hello. I was thinking about what you said about dark academia and the way that it like contains like these potentialities for imagining new world, but it's also caught up in the, the nature of being in the global literary marketplace and containing all of these, like what you said, like toxic traits of unwellness and such.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what you see is valuable about the genre in terms of its potential for producing like a a speculative aesthetic that goes against this kind of participation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as a genre, it's already so popular, and in that potential, there's a lot of room to bring new readers in when subverting it. I think that the romanticization of institution and finding institution as like a homey, like comfort space is also something that I feel like a lot of us as academics like tend to do. And then are like ultimately, if not already, like confronted with institutional violence. So I think like replicating that experience is valuable in the way of subverting it, if that makes sense.
So like the development of like the thing that you see, what I'm hearing you say is that the thing that holds the potentiality of dark academia is the capacity for community building.
Yeah.
That is still like inherent. That's interesting to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the community aspect and then the conveying of like academic concepts or analysis like through that sort of community makes sense. Yeah.
For Yesenia, thank you for your presentation. I did want to ask, as you were going through the fanzines, did you find commentary between the authors, like editorials or pieces where they talked about vampires and then kind of where they were taking them? Just curious on kind of like, was there feedback in the pages on what people were thinking?
Yeah, so when it came to fanzines, specifically the Mexican fanzine, this was the only one that I was actually able to access. I was looking for more fanzines. Couldn't find it. So this is the only one that I looked at. But the other short stories that were in the fanzine were mostly all about men, but it had a lot of male protagonists. It was vastly different than I'd say Baby Abuela Castro short story, which I highlight in the presentation. But there was like homages to earlier vampire stories, like Nosferatu, I think. But yeah, there was a lot across the board in this small fanzine, but I don't think enough that I could be able to answer the question.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Question for Amber. Do you think the implementation of other people's body parts played a large impact in the freedom of slaves, or do you think in a larger scale it didn't play such a large impact? Do you think?
Like historically?
Yeah. Based on research.
Honestly, I have a very what's the word? Hot take on the abolition of slavery. I think largely it was economic.
Yeah.
So generally, when you look at the historical perspectives of abolition, one of the things that we also mythologize is the idea that, yes, Northerners really did believe that Black people were people too. Realistically, they also looked at the South and realized that a slave market in the South meant that if they decided to also start to produce as well as more than just the base materials, the raw materials, if they started building factories that were then populated with slave work rather than wage work, they would outpace them all.
Yeah.
That was here for Northerners, and changing their laws to implement slavery wasn't as much of an option because of land issues.
Yeah.
So yes, I have a little bit of a hot take on that. I think especially looking at Spillers, the way that the body is sort of reimagined to allow slavery, it's flesh, it's a tool.
Yeah.
You really only look at it as that is flesh that is now for me to use. You can almost look at it in a like from Donna Haraway's cyborging theory, that body is now an extension of your body. So it depends on how you want to look at the use of a Black person's body during slavery and enslavement. Yeah, it's gross.
Question for Amber. You said that the way that you're thinking of contemporary narratives of slavery is kind of with an Afrofuturistic turn. Could you speak a little bit more about that? And how it differs from like the neo-slave narrative and like kindred forms.
So I think one of the main things that I kind of noticed when looking at more contemporary neo-slave narratives versus like a kindred or a beloved, not that long ago, right? I'm not saying these are like historic neo-slave narratives or anything, but there's a way that both end without a whole lot of hope. There is the recognition of this trauma of these missing narratives, but they just kind of end there. They let you know that that hole is still there, that trauma is still there. I think part of the difference here, and I'm not doing this work with Yajiasi, but if anybody's aware of Yajiasi, she also does this in Homegoing. There's a recognition of the trauma without viewing it as only a trauma. I think there's a way of looking at the historical ramifications of history and that reverberation into the future without saying, and now Black people are stuck with this. Like, this is the only way to identify yourself. I think that there's a way that more contemporary authors are recognizing that and then saying, okay, let's look at that and then continue to find ways to heal and move past that as the only way of visualizing ourselves. That's why I think that kind of recognizing the way that white supremacist history wants us to misremember, like our own places in that history. I think it's important to just recognize that. That's part of that adventure of healing, right? But maybe that's me being a little crazy.
I have a question for Isadora. So I totally buy your argument about violence being to some degree a necessary response to the violence of the institution, right? But I read Babel relatively recently, and I'm curious what you make of Victoire's character, because Robin feels like he succumbs to this fatalism, right? And he just sort of there's a violence, there's an inevitability to the violence that he gives in. And I'm not entirely sure how clear it was that that violence ends up being effective in the end.
Yeah.
Whereas Victoire refuses to participate in the violence, and we sort of, the book ends with her escaping. And there's there's a hopefulness that kind of contrasts to the fatalism of Robin's character. I just wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's definitely more than one way of approaching like institutional violence and combating institutional violence. That's certainly like my praxis. But I feel like the kind of it's interesting because Kwong does end on a hopeful note and on Victoria's escape. But I feel like the kind of like the crux and she posits sort of like this, in order for there to be historical fluidity, there has to be like some kind of violent act. And I think from that violent act, then we get like someone who escapes and who is like free to kind of like hope and continue to exist in that historical fluidity. But like the crux of the cause of that is that like violence is what I like sort of make of the end.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thanks so much to everyone for the presentations and apologies for coming a couple minutes late. I had a question for Yesenia specifically. Could you say a little about what else or who else was in the anthologies and the magazines and so on that have included Livia Brenda Castro? Because I really get the sense from your research that she's part of something bigger than herself and she's sort of representative. So I wonder if you could just say what the publications were, where you found some of her work collected, and or what else was in them.
Yeah. So for Livia Brenda Castro, and specifically in the fanzine, most of the other authors there were males, but the other material that I couldn't cover in this presentation, I found a 3-part volume called Criaturas de la Noche. It was published around 1998, and there was one volume specifically all about also vampires. But there was one that specific volume had other 2 female authors who were also writing about vampires, and their names are Lucia Calvo Sanchez and also Norma Macias Davalos, who also contributed to like those anthologies. But that collective was created from like a national contest created in Coahuila at the time, I think. And yeah, so there's like far and few in between like women, but they were very much active in the circles too. And that's kind of like the work that I'm doing archivally, hopefully, is like uncovering Latinas from late 20th century or a little bit older, and see how far like our Eaton collection kind of goes back to finding them. They were also, I want to acknowledge that they were academics, so that's how they were able to publish their work. Publishing in Mexico is very difficult and challenging. Specifically talking about like speculative fiction, the whole publishing thing is very different than the US. So yeah.
Yeah. You said we're just like thinking about like androgyny and vampires and like gender roles and stuff.
Mhm.
Could you say more about that? Like, do you have more thoughts?
Yeah, it's this very new. I'm usually used to working with Anglophonic literature. So this is a very new area of like entering into Mexican speculative fiction. This is why this fanzine was like sort of a love and hate relationship, why I kind of stuck with it, because and why I didn't want to add any theorists to it, because I really wanted like the archive to sort of speak to me and see what it was saying about gender generally. But yeah, I thought sort of androgyny with vampires is very interesting, specifically when they're visually it's depicted as feminine, but most of all the short stories are like all about men protagonists and very like masculine features and stuff. And Livia Brenda Castro was the only one who kind of like veered into like androgyny. And it was like really cool because it's transgressing sort of gender and sexuality in a new way that I think the male authors in the fanzine weren't really doing. It felt very like, yeah, like fetishistic from their perspective. But from a woman perspective, it didn't feel like that. It felt like the vampire was sort of representing yeah, like feminine features that I don't think usually is highlighted in Mexican speculative fiction. Yeah, but I'm still thinking about it. So yeah.
I have a question for Amber. I'm still trying to formulate, so I apologize. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the way power sort of operates in your story, or how your story makes us think differently about power, because I think that we tend to look at slavery as there's the master who has total power over the slaves or whatever. And then we think of rebellion or resistance to this power as this sort of binary forceful opposition or something like that. But your story is so fascinating in the way that and your reading of the story is so fascinating in the way that Washington's power is subverted in these kinds of subtle and interesting ways. And it's like the dehumanization of the slaves is unstable, right? It's like their humanity insists on being recognized, even though power is unable to see it. I wonder if you can kind of talk a little bit more about that, or what that makes you think.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that it's really interesting in the story is technically this is all only on view for a reader, right? Any person participating in the story, the people whose teeth are being given to Washington in this sale, however they were acquired, that's like a whole thing. They don't know that this magic has happened from the blacksmith. So the only person who is aware of this subversion at all is the blacksmith himself. So like the literal magical power that he has is working on a constant subversive level that like the community isn't even necessarily aware of, but it is eroding at like the kind of, and this is where it gets into that agency stuff that I have no idea how to touch. Because it is kind of affecting Washington, but it's doing so in a way that does feel very colonial in the sense that it is that cultural sharing. That way that he is wearing these teeth, he's giving into a sort of physical miscegenation that then turns into a cultural miscegenation. It's really interesting to see that done through the metaphor of him being literally affected by these teeth. Like there are the punctuations to each vignette that say exactly how the first tooth made him hear the hammering, the second tooth made him hear the merman's song. And then by the time we get to the last one, Emma's tooth made him want to free his slave. So he is unaware of the effects that are happening, and there's no sense that he ever really actually acknowledges that the tooth is changing him. Like his own visualization of his totalizing power makes him unaware. Like he can't recognize that he's being affected. I do think that there's an interesting way of using that to think about incremental change in institutions. It's very easy to see Washington and the slave master as a totalizing institution of power, and to see that sort of one person makes this change by accidentally calling on his community. It's like he didn't really ask his community, like, hey, stand up with me. But they are. Just by being there, just by being themselves and being recognized as an individual.
I think it's interesting. It's striking me now that there's a double powerlessness to Washington's character, right? He's both being affected and he's unaware that he's being affected. And if I don't know what to do with that.
I wonder if it doesn't get down to like that humanization a little bit, that sort of, in a way, Washington is accidentally recognizing the humanity of his slaves just because he's being affected by the teeth. He's being sort of pulled into their cultural artifacts in different ways. I know you've read Moten and oh
It has to.
no, not just Moten and Hester Scream, the other one, Gilroy?
Black Lantern.
I think so. But the idea of music and how it travels and sort of represents like diasporic ideas of blackness and how it changes through each place it goes to. The song itself, once it reaches Washington, he can't recognize what it's for, but it still like haunts him in that way, and he recognizes its power and its beauty to a certain level. It's just interesting the way each artifact is different from each spirit, but still changes him subtly.
I had a question for Yesenia about the vampire, the intersections of like romance and cannibalism when thinking about the vampire stories that you're talking about. There seems to be this kind of like romantic air or something in terms of like the vampiric act. There's also this like act of consumption as well. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about
Yeah,
that.
really great point that you bring up. I never thought about cannibalism. Yeah. Yeah, all the great point that you make, like all the vampire stories I was reading, all are inherently like lead into romance. So I do need to think about that, and I will write it down. Thank you very much.
Sure.
So first, thank you all for your presentations. I think I could probably have questions for for each of you, but I can maybe start with the question I have for Amber. So in your response to the last question, you sort of shifted towards thinking more specifically about your engagement with Black studies.
Mhm.
So I was curious about to what extent this work you're doing with the neo-slave narrative is or isn't indebted to Afro-pessimist critiques. And I was curious about if you could speak about your relationship to Afro-pessimism and your thinking about neo-slave narratives.
I'm gonna be super honest with you. No idea what Afro-pessimism is. Could you define that for me?
Oh, sure. So Afro-pessimism, I guess generally speaking or broadly speaking, it's a sort of field that locates itself within Black study, that in many ways is asking many of the same questions you are about neo-slave narratives and about the sort of continued life of the figure of the slave.
Okay.
That Black people must contend with and that the world continues to contend with. It thinks about the objection of Black people and of Blackness.
Okay. Yeah, so I think somehow I must have read around the term. Yeah, no, I think that sort of the entire idea of why I want to refer to it specifically as an Afrofuturist neo-slave narrative is that idea of like moving past a one-note view of Blackness, period. Like just that idea of, because I'm relatively new to Black studies. I started this project thinking it was mostly going to be like a post-colonial argument that like brought in a little bit of sociology, and then it just kept turning into problems with things not agreeing. And then I met with a very kind professor who was like, read everything on this list, and it was all Black studies, and it was all much better for what I was trying to do. However, it means that I only have like 20 things in Black studies that are really under like my belt. But yeah, the idea that I was trying to build on was essentially one, we only like to have monolithic views of our underrepresented voices in literature. We only want to see queer literature in one way. We only want to see female literature in one way. And if it's not doing the things that we want it to do, we get kind of mad at it for some reason, like, oh, it's not gay enough. Oh, it's not feminine enough. Oh, it's not black enough. So one of the things that I really wanted to talk about was like, how do we discuss authenticity in these things, and how do we view representations of our communities without necessarily getting mad if we don't see ourselves, right? As a very racially ambiguous person, it's kind of interesting to read some of these stories, and I don't generally see myself, right? So getting started with it, I wanted to think about, where do people like me fit into an Afrofuturist perspective? And then also, how do we continue to define Blackness without it becoming an empty signifier, if I am going to be included in this thing, right? So essentially, a lot of people do argue that the more that we open it up, the less Black means anything, right? I think that where I was trying to get to with my limited view of Black studies was trying to see if there isn't a way to recognize individuality in community. They're kind of diametrically opposed in a lot of ways. If you start to think of the individual, you stop thinking about communal effort. So in what ways does the new Afrofuturist neo-slave narrative perspective find a way to balance both, even though it's hard to think about both things at once? Hope that kind of answers.
Oh, yeah, yeah, thank you.
I have a question for Isadora. I like what you're talking about in terms of speculative fiction, translation, and fluidity. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about like how you're thinking through fluidity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in respect to this work, I'm looking up here as if it's there. It's time. No, it's okay. In respect to this work specifically, I'm thinking about speculative fiction as a fluid space in general, both by means of communicating marginalization and othership through like either the monstrous, magic, like the in-between spaces, kind of as a means of articulating the inarticulable. That is like hard to say. So fluidity for speculative fiction in that respect, as in there's a lot of space to communicate states of being that are not like termed realistic, but perhaps maybe convey people's experiences more accurately. And then historical fluidity, I think here comes out of this work as a kind of alternate history and as it's a work of speculative fiction, but it's also a work of kind of historical fiction in a way. I feel like the speculative element is a very small part of this broader, the magic element is a small part of this broader speculation on what would have changed if magic was implemented as a mode of like colonization. So there's fluidity there in that kind of openness to imagine that space. And then I think Kwong is also thinking about fluidity in the ending that I'm talking about, that I was talking about earlier in answering someone's question, was that there's the violence and then there's space for hope afterward. Like in hopes that this violence has changed the institution, there is space for hope. And that space is a kind of fluidity. And then more fluidity. I feel like I should like drop a coin in a jar every time I say this word. But then in translation, when moving between languages, there's space for things to be misread, there's space for interpretation. And I think that kind of fluidity also reflects the kind of cultural context versus ideas of being as well. Yeah. All of that. Yeah.
We have about 2 more minutes, so if there are any last minute questions. Is there anything on Zoom?
No.
Oh, more questions.
Sorry. Oh, sorry, was someone about to ask a question?
Go ahead.
Okay, I also had a question for Isadora. Especially because you, when you were introducing yourself, you referenced some of the strikes and encampments that have been happening on campus.
Mhm.
I'm curious about if you could speak more about any connection you see between dark academia as a genre and these sort of like inherent critiques of the university and maybe if you're familiar connections to abolitionist university movements.
Yeah, absolutely. I have less information about abolitionist university movements, but I can kind of, if it's helpful, speak sort of like how I'm thinking about this in relation to what's happening on my campus right now. I think that there, ooh. there's been a lot of there's sort of violence inherent in the UC system in general. Just like we deal arms, like we're very involved in all of these very like pro-Israel, very political like spaces. And my campus specifically is heavily connected to the military. So and basically like sent this kind of like armed militia to come and break up a peaceful protest. So I think like amid that kind of like ongoing violence, I'm not sure how I see sort of violent collective action in response on our campus or in like practice currently. I think that really people have been trying to keep things as peaceful as possible, but because of that violent action from like police force, we have seen sort of students being put in situations where they have to like kind of put their bodies on the line to protect each other. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh no, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. If there are any other questions, sorry. Break. But yeah, good job, everyone. Okay, well, we'll start at 10:30. And as a reminder for those of you who came in late, please make sure to grab a name tag, grab a trading card, and please sign in.